Morning dawns in a pastoral setting in the American Midwest. Suddenly, the morning tranquility is shattered by an apparition of a bygone age. She is Iowa Interstate number 6988, a living reminder of the age of steam. Today, she harkens back to the days when America was built by the power of steam. The first steam locomotives came to America in the 1830s. These primitive machines running on flimsy rails kicked off an industrial boom that would make America a world economic powerhouse. In less than 50 years, a growing network of rails spread across the continent, linking the Atlantic to the Pacific and most points in between. As the railroads grew, so did both the size of the trains and the locomotives that pulled them. The steam locomotive grew in size and power, with new designs reaching milestones unheard of only a few years before. By the 1940s, locomotives roamed the countryside that were capable of pulling a mile or more of freight cars, or of speeding passengers along at better than 80 miles per hour. But while the steam locomotive was a capable machine, it required an army of workers to maintain and operate. It also required lots of maintenance, and time in the shops, along with the required support infrastructure, was a huge expense. In the 1930s, a new type of locomotive, the diesel-electric, was proving that it could do anything the steam locomotive could do, and do it cheaper with fewer people. The Second World War slowed the railroad's adoption of the new diesels, but once the war was over, the transition began in earnest. Passenger trains were quickly taken over by the flashy new engines, complete with matching streamlined trains. Freight locomotives came next, and by the mid-50s, one railroad after another dropped their steam locomotives' fires for good. By 1960, the age of steam had come to an end on America's railroads. The route of today's Iowa Interstate Railroad was once a part of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. The Rock Island was one of numerous so-called Granger lines in the Midwest, and after completing its transition to diesels in 1953, became famous for its streamlined fleet of rocket passenger trains. As one of several parallel railroads competing for the same traffic base, the Rock Island fell on hard times in the 1960s. The railroad began losing money in 1965 and was bankrupt 10 years later. By the end of 1984, the Rock Island was no more, and its assets had been liquidated. The route from Chicago to Omaha was purchased by the Heartland Rail Corporation, and the Iowa Interstate Railroad was formed on November 2, 1984, to lease and operate the line. In 2003, both the Iowa Interstate and the tracks on which it operated were bought by the Railroad Development Company, a holding company based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Even as the steam locomotive faded into history in America, it lived on in other parts of the world. One of the last places steam held on was in China, where in 1995 the new Ji Tong Railway opened to traffic, completely steam-powered. The Ji Tong's locomotives came used from the Chinese State Railway, where they were being set aside for diesels and were available on the cheap. The railroad went with steam power for economic reasons. Spending less on locomotives allowed more money to be spent building a well-constructed railroad. More modern locomotives would come later, and this meant the Ji Tong steam locomotives were on borrowed time from the outset. Purchased from China Rail were around 100 locomotives of the QJ class of 210-2. These locomotives had 2 pilot wheels in front, 10 drive wheels for power, and 2 wheels behind the drivers to support the weight of the firebox. Roughly 4,700 QJs were built between 1956 and 1988, when steam locomotive production ceased in China. The QJs were based on a Russian design, which in turn had been influenced by American locomotives of the late teens and early 20s. As the last steam-powered mainline railroad in the world, the Ji Tong Railway, and primarily the portion of the route over Jingpeng Pass, received international attention from fans of the steam locomotive. This was often to the bewilderment and amusement of the locals who couldn't see what all the fuss was about. One of the legions of steam fans who traveled to China to see the QJs in action was the founder of the Railroad Development Company.
My name is Henry Posner. I'm the chairman of the Iowa Interstate Railroad, also chairman of Railroad Development Corporation. I have been a Railfan since approximately 1969. Because that's when I bought my first copy of Trains magazine, which would have made me 14 years old. I got a little bit of a start with model railroading, but it was a copy of Trains magazine in '69 that really caught my attention. I went to China in the summer of 1981, which was relatively early in terms of being able to travel to China. And we went to the Datong Locomotive Works, and we were there when we saw a QJ being wheeled. So we actually went to the birthplace of the QJs. And then in 1986, went back to China and did some travel behind steam, because unfortunately, during our first visit, none of our trains were steam-hauled. But in the final months of steam operation over Jingpeng Railway, I was able to go there along with the hundreds of other people and be there for that. That was truly memorable because we realized there was something that was never going to be repeated.
The Ji Tong Railway's first diesels arrived in 2000, and by early 2006, steam was all but gone. With the QJs being retired, Mr. Posner had an idea to bring some of them to America in operating condition.
The inspiration was the lack of anybody else putting their hand up and doing anything. In the railroad world, we're known as investors of last resort. And in this particular case, we were preservationists of last resort. A number of people looked at doing something, but at the end of the day, there was only us. So we did it.
3 locomotives were selected to go to America. 2 of those, number 6988 and 7081, would go to the Iowa Interstate. Both of them were historically significant.
That was a complete, accidental, unintended jackpot. As it turns out, those locomotives were chosen for overhaul because they were still in service and they were therefore in relatively good condition. Little did we know how historic those locomotives were. The 7081 hauled the world's last mainline steam scheduled passenger train, and the 6988 hauled the world's last regularly scheduled steam-hauled freight.
With the locomotives chosen, the pair was sent to the shop for an overhaul in March 2006. Not much restoration work was needed, as both were still operational. However, there were years of wear and tear that needed to be repaired. The locomotives were stripped down, and the boilers, appliances, and moving parts were renewed. A few other items were added to bring them up to code for use in the U.S. These included federally mandated safety glass for the windows and handrails at several locations. Bells were also added to the pair, for while they are not used in China, they are mandatory on all American locomotives. With the overhauls completed in just a matter of weeks, it was time for the locomotives to be sent to their new home.
The locomotives were moved on their own wheels to a port in China, and then they came on a heavy lift ship, basically down in the hold. And they were winched on and off with ship's gear.
The locomotives were loaded aboard the ship on April 17, 2006, for the long journey to a new home half a world away. The locomotives arrived in the U.S. via the Gulf of Mexico on June 10th and were loaded on flat cars for the remainder of the journey to Iowa. Once on the Iowa Interstate, number 6988 and 7081 were made ready to run at the engine shop in Iowa City. On September 14th, the pair was unveiled during a celebration in Rock Island. The next day, the pair doubleheaded on their first excursion train, making a round trip to Homestead, Iowa. On September 16th, the pair of QJs ran a triple header with restored Milwaukee Road steam locomotive number 261.
The 261 is a big engine, and it was not exactly a tonnage train. We did our part to keep the train going. The organizer of the event arranged for the 261 to come with the train and insurance, and because it was on the Iowa Interstate and because we had the QJs, it just came naturally.
This was the first time in 15 years that 3 steam locomotives teamed up on the same train on the main line in the U.S., and the first in the Midwest since the steam era. The following day, the pair was back in action with another double-headed excursion. Following the inaugural weekend, it was decided to return the locomotives to their Iowa home on a revenue freight train. The decision was made to set a record for the heaviest freight train behind steam in the 21st century.
That was, as I recall, my idea, because those locomotives did haul heavy freight trains. In China, they didn't load them down to a tonnage train because they needed to keep the trains moving. but nothing like that had been done in recent decades, so we decided we would go out and make a tiny bit of railroad history.
In July of 2011, Rock Island was the site for a large railroad festival. In addition to several other steam locomotives and vintage diesels, the pair of QJs would be star performers. On July 20th, the pair hauled a revenue freight train to Rock Island. At the Rock Island Festival, number 6988 unveiled a new Americanized appearance, replacing the look she sported since her days in regular service in China. On the 24th, number 6988 headed up a round trip to Homestead, Iowa. A pair of Amtrak diesels tagged along, providing electricity for the passenger cars and a helping hand when the steam locomotive needed a boost. In 2014, it was decided that a nonprofit organization would be the best way to care for numbers 6988 and 7081.
What we wanted to do was have an organization focused on preservation, and in particular the QJs, which is quite different from the mission and organization of a regional freight railroad. Preservation is important and deserves its own organization, and we felt that that would do the most justice to the locomotives.
The Central States Steam Preservation Association was chartered in August 2014, and the pair of locomotives were leased from the railroad. Today, the locomotives are stored and maintained at the Iowa Interstate Yard at Newton, Iowa. Number 6988 is currently the star of the pair of QJs, and she serves as a Goodwill Ambassador. Her operations take her to communities along the route of the Iowa Interstate, where she operates trips for the public to benefit local first responders. How did this come about?
As I recall, that came from Mick Burkhardt, and it has worked out so well for the Iowa Interstate and the QJs because it's the perfect alignment of our prime objective, which is safety, in a way that reaches local communities, and it's worked very, very well for us over the years. But as I recall, because I definitely did not come up with this one, as I recall, it was Mick Burkhardt's idea. It's been extraordinarily successful for the fire departments. We get invited back on a regular basis. The railroad likes it. It's been great for us.
Dawn finds us at Mitchellville, Iowa on an August morning in 2018. Number 6988 is in town for 5 sold-out runs to Altoona to benefit the Mitchellville Fire Department. These short trips operate with the steam locomotive on one end and a diesel on the other. This allows the train to operate in an out and back fashion without the need to turn the train around at each end of the run. The next morning, number 6988 is back on the road at Grinnell, Iowa, as she heads to Brooklyn for another series of sold-out trips. Number 6988 doesn't just stay in Iowa. In May 2019, she visited Illinois for a series of runs. Seats were once again sold out for 5 runs from Chillicothe on the line to Peoria. The trains run rain or shine, and the cool, wet weather as the front moved through resulted in some dramatic images of number 6988 in action. The next morning, number 6988 was headed west to Anawan for 5 more packed trains. Headed back to her home in Newton, a half a world away from her birthplace, she still roams the rails. Today she has a different job to do, but it's a job she does well. She's QJ number 6988, a living reminder of the age of steam. For more information on the QJs, check out the Central States Steam Preservation Association's Facebook page. There you'll find updates, including announcements of upcoming trips. You can also find out how you can help keep QJs 6988 and 7081 on the road in the future.